In this series of short videos, we will be introducing you to the Military Aviation Preservation Society, or MAPS, Air Museum, and some of the aircraft and displays that are located at our facility in Greene, Ohio. We hope that these presentations enhance your appreciation of history and those that lived it. Man's fascination with flight and a desire to fly has always been with us. A quote attributed to Leonardo da Vinci gives you one view of this obsession. It reads, "Once you have tasted flight, you will forever walk the earth with your eyes turned skyward, for there you have been, and there you will always long to return." At MAPS, the history of aviation is more than just airplanes. It is about those who have dreamed of flying, those who made those dreams a reality, and those that have experienced the freedom of flight. We hope to share that and more with you in these video presentations. We'll cover the background of each type of aircraft as well as the history of the airframe that we have here at the museum. In some cases, we have dedicated specific aircraft to local men and women. If this is the case, we will discuss why we decided to dedicate an aircraft to them. In this video, we will introduce you to the Martin B-26 Marauder medium bomber. The airframe at MAPS is one of only 7 of these aircraft left in the world and the oldest of the still existing Marauders. While initially saddled with a bad reputation, modifications to the airframe and additional training resulted in the aircraft being considered one of the most reliable bombers of World War II. The Martin B-26 Marauder was a World War II twin-engine medium bomber built by the Glenn Martin Company. First used in the Pacific Theater in early 1942, it was also used in the Mediterranean Theater and Western Europe. After entering service with the U.S. Army, the aircraft received a reputation of being a widowmaker due to the early model's high accident rate during takeoffs and landings. The Marauder had to be flown at exact airspeeds, particularly when landing or when one engine was out. The 150 mph speed on short final approach was intimidating to pilots who were used to much slower speeds, and whenever they slowed down below what the manual called for, the aircraft would stall and crash. The B-26 would become a safer aircraft once crews were retrained and after an increase of wingspan and incidence to give better takeoff performance, and a larger fin and rudder were added. The aircraft distinguished itself as, quote, "the chief bombardment weapon on the Western Front," end quote, according to United States Army Air Force's dispatch from 1946. The Marauder ended World War II with the lowest combat loss rate of any U.S. AAF bomber. Martin produced a total of 5,288 Marauders between February 1941 and March 1945. Over 500 of these were flown by the Royal Air Force, the South African Air Force, and the Free French Air Force. By the time the United States Air Force was created as an independent service separate from the Army in 1947, all Martin B-26s had been retired from U.S. service. The Douglas A-26 Invader, which had taken over the Marauder's role, then assumed the B-26 designation. In March of 1939, the United States Army Air Corps issued Circular Proposal 39-640, a specification for a twin-engine medium bomber demanding a maximum speed of 350 mph, a range of 3,000 miles, and a bomb load of 2,000 pounds. On July 5, 1939, the Glenn Martin Company submitted its design, produced by a team led by Peyton M. Magruder, the Martin Model 179. Martin's design was evaluated as superior to the other proposals and was awarded a contract for 201 aircraft to be designated B-26. The B-26 went from paper concept to an operational bomber in approximately 2 years. Additional orders for a further 930 B-26s followed in September of 1940, still before the type's first flight. The B-26 was a shoulder-winged monoplane of all-metal construction fitted with a tricycle landing gear. It had a streamlined circular section fuselage housing a crew of 5 to 7. Early models were armed with single 30 or 50 caliber machine guns in the nose, tail, and waist positions. A dorsal turret was armed with two 50 caliber machine guns, the first powered dorsal turret to be fitted to a U.S. bomber. Later models carried as many as 12 50 caliber guns. Two bomb bays were fitted mid-fuselage, capable of carrying 5,800 pounds of bombs, although in practice such a bomb load reduced range too much, and the aft bomb bay usually carried additional fuel tanks instead of bombs. B-26s were powered by two Pratt & Whitney R2800 double WASP radial engines, typically of 2,000 horsepower each. Mounted in nacelles slung under the wing, they drove 13.5-foot diameter four-bladed propellers. The wings were of low aspect ratio with a small area for an aircraft of its weight, giving the required high performance but also resulting in a wing loading of 53 pounds per square foot for the initial versions, which at the time was the highest of any aircraft accepted for service by the Army Air Corps. The first B-26, with Martin test pilot William K. Ken Ebel at the controls, flew on November 25, 1940, and was effectively the prototype. Deliveries to the U.S. Army Air Corps began in February of 1941 with the second aircraft, 40-1362. In March of 1941, the Army Air Corps started accelerated service testing of the B-26 at Patterson Field, Ohio. While the B-26 was a fast aircraft with better performance than the contemporary North American B-25 Mitchell, its small wing area and resulting high wing loading required unprecedented landing speeds. At least two of the earliest B-26s suffered hard landings and damage to the main landing gear, engine mounts, propellers, and fuselage. The type was grounded briefly in April of 1941 to investigate the landing difficulties. Two causes were found: insufficient landing speed producing a stall and improper weight distribution. The latter was due to the lack of a dorsal turret because the Martin power turret was not yet ready. Improper weight distribution was not the only reason for the collapses of the landing gear. They also occurred during low-speed taxiing, takeoff, and landing. Occasionally the strut unlocked. In addition to retrofitting the Martin electric turret to some of the first B-26s, Martin also began testing a taller vertical stabilizer and a revised tail gunner's position in 1941. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 engines were reliable, but the Curtiss electric pitch change mechanism in the propellers required impeccable maintenance. Human error and some failures of the mechanism occasionally placed the propeller blades in a flat pitch and resulted in an overspeeding propeller, sometimes known as a runaway prop. Due to its sound and the possibility that the propeller blades could disintegrate, this situation was particularly frightening for air crews. Another challenge was a loss of power in one engine, especially during takeoff. For a time in 1942, pilots in training believed that the B-26 could not be flown on one engine. This was disproved by experienced pilots, including a dramatic demonstration flight by General Jimmy Doolittle. Still, the B-26 was not an aircraft for novices. Unfortunately, due to the need to train many pilots quickly for the war, relatively inexperienced pilots got into the cockpit and the accident rate increased accordingly. This occurred at the same time as more experienced B-26 pilots of the 22nd, 38th, and 42nd bombardment groups were proving the merits of the bomber. In 1942, Glenn Martin was called before the so-called Truman Committee, a Senate special committee investigating defense contracting abuses. Senator Harry Truman asked Martin why the B-26 had troubles. Martin responded that the wings were too short. Truman asked why the wings weren't changed. When Martin said the plans were too far along and besides his company already had the contract, Truman's response was quick and to the point. In that case, the contract would be canceled. Martin then agreed to make corrections to the wings. By February of 1943, the newest model, the B-26B-10, had an additional 6 feet of wingspan, plus uprated engines, more armor, and larger guns. Indeed, the regularity of crashes by pilots training at MacDill Field, up to 15 in one 30-day period, led to the exaggerated catchphrase, "one a day in Tampa Bay." Apart from accidents occurring over land, 13 Marauders ditched in Tampa Bay in the 14 months between the first one on August 5, 1942, to the final one on October 8, 1943. In addition to Widowmaker, B-26 crews gave the plane other colorful nicknames including Martin Murderer, Flying Coffin, and B-Crash. The B-26 remained a challenging aircraft to fly and continued to be unpopular with some pilots throughout its military career. In 1944, in answer to pilots complaining to the press and their relatives back home, the Army, Air Force, and Martin took an unusual step during a war. They commissioned extensive articles that were placed in various popular publications, educating the public and defending the flying record of the B-26. The B-26 Marauder was used mostly in Europe, but also saw action in the Mediterranean and the Pacific. In early combat, the aircraft took heavy losses, but was still one of the most successful medium-range bombers used by the U.S. Army Air Force. The B-26 was initially deployed on combat missions in the Southwest Pacific in the spring of 1942, but most of the B-26s subsequently assigned to operational theaters were sent to England or the Mediterranean theater. By the end of World War II, it had flown more than 110,000 missions and had dropped 150,000 tons of bombs. It was also used in combat by British, Free French, and South African units. The B-26 began to equip the 22nd Bombardment Group at Langley Field, Virginia in February 1941, replacing the B-18 Bolo. A further 2 bombardment groups were equipped with B-26s by December. Immediately following the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, the 22nd was deployed to the Southwest Pacific, being sent by ship to Hawaii and then flown to Australia. The 22nd flew its first combat mission, an attack on Rabaul, which required an immediate stop at Port Moresby, New Guinea on April 5, 1942. The 38th Bombardment Group received its B-26s in November of 1941. Immediately after the entry of the United States into World War II, plans to send the 38th Bomb Group to the Southwest Pacific equipped with B-26Bs fitted with additional auxiliary fuel tanks and provisions for carrying aerial torpedoes were developed. 4 of these aircraft were deployed to Midway Island in the build-up to the Battle of Midway and carried out torpedo attacks against the Japanese fleet on June 4, 1942. 2 B-26s were shot down, with the remaining 2 severely damaged. Their torpedoes failed to hit any Japanese ships. They did shoot down 1 A-6M fighter and killed 2 seamen aboard the aircraft carrier Akagi with machine gun fire. 2 squadrons were detached from the 38th Bomb Group in May of 1942 and deployed to Australia to join the 22nd. But it was decided to standardize on the B-25 Mitchell in the Southwest Pacific Theater. The B-26 flew its last combat missions in the theater on January 9, 1944. 2 more squadrons of torpedo-armed Marauders were used for anti-shipping operations in the Aleutians Island campaign, but there are no records of any successful torpedo attack by a U.S. Army Air Force B-26. The 17th, 319th, and 320th Bombardment Groups were allocated to support Operation Torch, the Allied invasion of French North Africa in November of 1942. They were initially used to carry out low-level attacks against heavily defended targets, taking heavy losses with poor results, before switching to much more successful medium-level attacks. By the end of the North African campaign, the three B-26 groups had flown 1,587 missions, losing 80 aircraft. The B-26 continued in service with the 12th Air Force, supporting the Allied advance through Sicily, Italy, and southern France. The B-26 entered service with the 8th Air Force in England in early 1943, with the 322nd Bombardment Group flying its first missions in May 1943. Early missions were like those flown in North Africa, with B-26s flying at low level and were even less successful. The second mission, flown without fighter cover against the power station at IJmuiden, Netherlands, resulted in the loss of the entire attacking force of 11 B-26s to anti-aircraft fire and Luftwaffe FW-190 fighters. Following this disaster, the UK-based B-26 force was switched to medium-altitude operations and transferred to the 9th Air Force to support the planned invasion of France. Bombing from altitudes of 10,000 to 15,000 feet and with appropriate fighter escort, the Marauder proved far more successful. Striking a variety of targets, including bridges and V-1 launching sites in the build-up to D-Day, B-26 groups moved to bases in France as they became available. Marauders operating from medium altitude proved to be highly accurate, with the 9th Air Force rating it the most accurate bomber available in the final month of the war in Europe. Loss rates were far lower than in the early low-level days. The 9th Air Force stated that the B-26 had the lowest loss rate in the European theater of operations at less than 0.5%. The B-26 flew its last combat missions against the German garrison on May 1, 1945. The last U.S. Marauder units in Europe disbanded by early 1946, with most of the planes scrapped on site. In 1942, 52 B-26A Marauders, designated Marauder 1 by the Royal Air Force, were offered to the United Kingdom under Lend-Lease. Like the earlier Martin, Maryland, and Baltimore bombers, these were sent to the Mediterranean, replacing the Bristol Blenheims of No. 14 Squadron in Egypt. No. 14 Squadron flew its first operational mission on November 6, 1942. The Royal Air Force, or RAF Marauders, were used for long-range reconnaissance, mine-laying, and anti-shipping strikes. Unlike the U.S. Marauders, 14th Squadron made productive use of the option of carrying torpedoes, sinking several merchant ships with these weapons. The B-26 also proved useful in disrupting enemy air transport, shooting down considerable numbers of German and Italian transport aircraft flying between Italy and North Africa. In 1943, 100 long wingspan Marauder II B-26Cs equipped 12 and 24 squadrons of the South African Air Force, or SAAF. These squadrons flew missions over the Aegean, Crete, and Italy. Martin supplied a further 350 Marauder III B-26F and G models in 1944, with South African squadrons 21 and 30 joining the 12th and 24th in Italy to form an all-Marauder wing. SAAF 25 Squadron re-equipped with Marauders, and a new RAF 39 Squadron was armed with Marauders as part of the Balkan Air Force supporting Tito's partisans in Yugoslavia. A Marauder of 25 Squadron SAAF, on the unit's last mission of the Second World War on May 4, 1945, was the last Marauder to be lost in combat by any user. The British and South African aircraft were quickly scrapped following the end of the war, the United States not wanting the Lend-Lease aircraft to be returned. Following Operation Torch, several French bomber squadrons were re-equipped with the B-26, being used to support operations in Italy and the Allied invasion of southern France. Replaced in squadron service by 1947, two lingered on as testbeds for jet engines, one of these remaining in use until 1958. In developing the histories of the aircraft located at the MAPS Air Museum, all available resources are researched and compiled. While most of the source materials agree, some of the information is occasionally inconsistent. If this is the case, the information that is presented represents facts obtained from official sources whenever possible. The airplane on display at Maps Air Museum, serial number 40-1459, was delivered to the U.S. Army Air Force on June 30, 1941. It was the 99th B-26 off the assembly line and part of the initial order of 201 short-winged versions of the B-26 manufactured by the Martin factory in Baltimore. In October of 1941, it was sent to the Sacramento Air Depot to be winterized. Assigned to the 4th Air Force, 40-1459 was part of a 3-plane flight of B-26s that took off from Edmonton, Alberta, Canada on January 16, 1942. The destination for the flight was Elmendorf Field in Alaska, where the bombers were to defend Alaska against an expected attack by the Japanese. The planes had full fuel loads but ran low after running into foul weather. The pilots agreed to a forced landing in a shallow valley near the town of Smith River at the headwater of the Grayling River in northern British Columbia. Two of the B-26s, 40-1459 and 40-1501, belly landed and damaged their undersides, but their crews were unharmed. 40-1464 was the last to land and put down its landing gear to slow its approach. Unfortunately, the area was a frozen semi-swamp and the plane's nose dug into the ground, throwing pilot Second Lieutenant William J. Dancer, Jr. through the cockpit window and knocking out the co-pilot, Second Lieutenant Howard F. Smiley. The remaining crew members were uninjured, provided first aid to the pilots, and set up shelter beneath the plane's wing. All 3 crews were rescued. Later in January of 1942, 40-1459 received the notation, wrecked 16 Jan 42, crashed in Canada, damage unknown. In February of 1942, the plane was condemned by Elmendorf. Similar cryptic notes record the fate of the 2 accompanying planes. 40-1464, which had been delivered July 11, 1941, was cracked up in Canada, damage unknown. For 40-1501, delivered August 12, 1941, it was cracked up somewhere in Canada, damage unknown. Both were also listed as condemned in February of 1942. In April of 1942, the Army Air Force sent crews to salvage the planes, removing engines, landing gear, radio equipment, weapons, and anything else worth taking. Crews painted a large yellow X across each wing near the engine. The markings alerted pilots of other aircraft that the downed planes were known crashes so they wouldn't be reported as new ones and that they had been salvaged. The planes remained in the area until 1971. In mid-September, after obtaining permission from military officials and the Canadian government, a group led by David Talichet Jr. from the Military Aircraft Restoration Corporation of Chino, California, set out to recover the planes. They were all still in olive drab and they had the red dots in the middle of the painted star markings that were later eliminated to avoid confusion with the red rising sun symbol in Japanese aircraft. There were no engines or propellers, the leading edges and glass were gone, and they'd been vandalized over the years. The men began to painstakingly dismantle the planes and prepare them to be airlifted from the valley by helicopter. It was a tough job using only hand tools. Freezing temperatures and snow made working conditions miserable. Helicopters that were to take the group from the valley also didn't arrive as scheduled, leaving the men severely short of food as their time in the valley stretched out to about 3 weeks, with one suffering frostbite feet and another an injured leg. Finally, a huge Sikorsky S-58T turbine-powered helicopter arrived to lift the sections of the B-26s from their resting place of nearly a half-century and carry them about 10 miles to a deserted airstrip along the Smith River. In early November, the sections were transported by flatbed railroad cars to Ontario, California, and then by trucks for the final 15 miles to Chino, California. Crews there would work on them for 19 years. Finally, on May 2, 1991, B-26 serial number 40-1464, with the nose section from another of the downed planes replacing its own damaged nose, flew again. Parts of the other two airframes, primarily aircraft 40-1459, started arriving at the MAPS facility adjacent to Akron-Canton Regional Airport in August of 1994. The tail section arrived on August 6th, with the nose and center sections arriving on August 27th. The wings reached the group's facility 2 days later. We've cleaned out the interior of the tail section, then Restoration Crew Chief John J. Viskovitz Jr. said in a May 10, 1995 interview. We want to take it outside and run a high-pressure hose on it to clean the outside of it and to flush some of the interior. We've vacuumed as much as we can of the inside. In his interview, Viskovitz continued, "We have nothing on the inside, no electronics or hydraulics. All those old cables are shot and must be taken out. Some of the tubing lines are bent and must be replaced. The fuselage isn't made of one thickness of skin. It varies from .032 inch all the way up to .081 inch in different sections." MAPS member Jack Smith constructed heavy-duty cradles for the sections, including rollers that allowed improved access and portability. As was expected from the forced landing, the center section's belly was ripped. The plane had also sustained damage during the salvage operation that cleaved several gaping holes into the metal skin. The bomb bay section had rolled off a truck bed while being shipped. There were many bullet holes in the tail by the star where people used it for target practice. The group faced a difficult task, restoring a virtual empty shell of a plane without readily available replacement parts. Because of the Army's salvage efforts, the plane didn't have control yokes, crew seats, the upper gun turret, nose plexiglass, its tail cone, engines, or propellers. The plane had its landing gear and wheels, but no tires. All the plexiglass throughout the plane needed to be replaced. A major step was to repair or replace many of the formers that shaped the fuselage of the plane. Both ailerons were repaired and recovered in fabric and installed, while the restoration team also scratch-built and installed both wingtips. They engineered new wing leading edge ribs and manufactured parts for one horizontal stabilizer and one elevator. The team installed all three of the landing gear and new tires. The aircraft was on its gear for the first time in 7 decades. New plexiglass was formed for the escape hatches over the pilots, and both units were rebuilt and installed. Even the original reinforcing ribs are in place. Both the navigator and radio operator tables were built from scratch. Crew Chief Dave Poskey was casually browsing eBay when he came across a rather remarkable find, an original B-26 pilot seat in mint condition. In 2004, the restoration team built a rotisserie-style wing fixture to hold the wings during restoration. By means of a hand crank and a 288-to-1 reduction gear, the wing could be slowly rotated to give better access for repair work. They first worked on the left wing. New fixtures were made to repair the heavily damaged nacelles and trailing sections. They had to painstakingly make many wing ribs from scratch. Sometimes entire assemblies were made completely from drawings with no physical reference. Ribs were made on wooden forms and then formed into shape. New ribs were made for both the left and right wings at this time to speed up work on the right wing. In 2011, the left wing was changed out for the right wing in the rotating fixture. The right wing was completed in 2012 and the wings were mated to the fuselage. Restoration crew member Don Neidert spent a couple of years building the wing's leading edges a section at a time in his barn at home. 2 Pratt & Whitney R2800 radial engines were removed from MAP's Douglas A-26 Invader. The engines were cleaned, painted, and then installed on the Marauder using the A-26 motor mounts. The crew spent 2 years building the engine cowls. Other than one part for the bottom left cowl, everything had to be scratch built. Later, replacement R-2800s were added to the Invader. Marauder propellers are like the proverbial hen's teeth. They were missing, and the team began to despair of ever finding proper replacements. But, almost as if by magic, an original set of Curtiss Electric propellers were located and installed. In early 2015, the crew made the plexiglass nose cone using a frame holding 8 curved segments and a flat bombardier's panel. They also completed the replacement windshield pieces. The last major piece of the restoration was the Martin 250 CE gun turret, one of the most widely used turrets in World War II. The turret was electrically powered with the gunner sitting between the 250 caliber machine guns. The rebuildable turret was received in 2015. It was torn down, cleaned, painted, and reassembled. A new plexiglass bubble was added and the turret installed in October of 2019. After these and many other small projects like adding navigator and radio operator chairs, main landing gear doors, instruments, simulated 500-pound bombs, and a replica Mark 13 torpedo, the restoration is considered complete. The Martin B-26 bomber at the Maps Air Museum maintains a place of honor as both a rare airframe and a representative of a generation of aircraft designed for war. It also serves as a reminder of all the airmen who flew her and all the other aircraft of that era. The Maps B-26 serial number 40-1459 is on loan from the Military Aircraft Restoration Corporation of Chino, California, a subsidiary of the Specialty Restaurants Corporation.